Hello again, A&P students. In this lecture, I'm going to be covering the second part of the Chapter 6 material. This is part 2 of the Integumentary System, and I'm going to be covering appendages of the skin, types of secretions that we find within the skin, as well as some injuries that can occur to the skin, such as burns. Okay, so appendages of the skin. Another term for appendages of the skin are secondary organs of the skin. Also known as accessory organs. So the following are derivatives of the epidermis. We have sweat glands, oil glands, hairs and hair follicles, and nails. So I've already covered types of secretions in my histology lecture, but it bears repeating here because we are going to see a number of types of secretions in skin accessory organs. Serous glands are going to be glands that produce a thin, watery secretion. So all of these are going to be serous secretions: perspiration, sweat, milk, tears, and digestive juices. All of these are largely going to be water. Of course, there's dissolved waste products and nutrients in all of these, but for the most part, it is going to have a consistency very similar to water. Then there's the mucus glands. They produce a glycoprotein called mucin, which absorbs water to form the secretion known as mucus. And these are produced by goblet cells, which are unicellular mucus glands. These are apparent in many of our histological samples, particularly some of the pseudostratified columnar and stratified columnar epithelial tissues that are characteristic of the lining of the upper respiratory tract, for example. There are mixed glands that contain both serous and mucus cell types and produce a mixture of the two types of secretions. And then there are also cytogenic glands, which release whole cells in the case of reproductive system, sperm and egg cells. There are 3 different modes of secretion that I'll cover. So a mode of secretion is basically how products are exported outside of the gland or the cell. So I'll be covering merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine modes of secretion. Merocrine secretion is used by eccrine glands, which are a type of sweat gland, for example. These use vesicles that release their secretion via exocytosis. Exo, think exit. This is a form of active transport in which you have vesicles, which are essentially little bubbles of membrane, which will fuse with the cell membrane and then release their products outside of the cell. So an example of this would be tear glands, the pancreas in terms of its exocrine functionality for digestive juices, and gastric glands. We have apocrine secretion. This is similar to exocytosis, but rather than having a vesicle fuse with the plasma membrane and then releasing the products on the other side free of that vesicle, you basically have the continuation of a vesicle outside of the cell or gland. So we have a lipid droplet that's covered by membrane and cytoplasm that buds off from the cell surface. An example of this would be milk fat secretion in female mammary gland cells. And it's also important to note that this term apocrine is used to describe axillary sweat glands, even though they actually use merocrine secretion. So it can get a little bit confusing in terms of just semantics, but keep that in mind when we're referring to apocrine sweat glands. It's kind of a different use of the word. They are actually using the American secretion mode. And then finally we have holocrine secretion, which is where cells accumulate a product until they disintegrate. So the secretion in this case is actually going to be a mixture of synthesized substances and fragments from those cells that have disintegrated. Examples here would be oil glands in the scalp and skin, as well as glands of the eyelid. So here this illustration is basically showing mitosis occurring in the basal cells that are going to replace the cells that disintegrate and die. Disintegrating cells are shown towards the top here, and then the secretion itself, which will be released on the surface of the skin, is going to be synthesized substances as well as actual fragments of these cells that have broken down. Okay, let's talk briefly about sweat glands. There's two main types of sweat glands. These are also known as pseudoriferous glands. We have the eccrine sweat glands, which are, they function in the merocrine form of secretion. They are abundant on the palms, the soles, and the forehead. The sweat is going to be largely water, so 99% water, also NaCl, which is common table salt, vitamin C, antibodies, dermcidin, which is one of those antimicrobial peptides, and then metabolic wastes are also going to be dissolved in this solution here. We have ducts that connect to pores, so this would be an example of an exocrine gland. And the primary function here is going to be thermoregulation, which is regulating body temperature. So this is showing the eccrine gland. Again, this is a sweat gland. So this will be found in the dermis, which is the middle layer of the integument. And then this would be a sectioned eccrine gland, so basically a transverse section of a histological slide showing these ducts within this system of a gland. The apocrine sweat glands, these are confined to the axillary and anogenital regions of the body, and they produce what is known as sebum, which is sweat plus fatty substances and proteins. And as a result, particularly from these fatty substances, this is more of a sensible perspiration, so it is going to produce a characteristic smell. The ducts actually connect to hair follicles, so you will see apocrine sweat gland ducts right adjacent to hair follicles, and as a result, the sebum will basically be pushed out alongside the hair. And these are only functional from puberty onward. One of the hypothesized functions for apocrine sweat glands would be to act as sexual scent glands. We also have a few other glands of note. Specialized apocrine glands, the ceruminous glands in our external ear canal secrete cerumen, which is the technical term for earwax. This, of course, is going to function as a barrier, so it helps to prevent water infiltrating the ear, for example. It helps to trap dirt, debris, even small organisms such as flying insects from reaching the inner part of our ear. And then we have mammary glands for females, which of course produce milk. Our sebaceous or oil glands are widely distributed. Most are going to develop from hair follicles. They become active at puberty, and they produce the secretion known as sebum. This is an oily holocrine secretion, so there's going to be a lot of fatty acids in it. Holocrine, again, remember that that is going to be the substances being secreted as well as the products of cells breaking down themselves. It is bactericidal, which means it has antimicrobial properties, and it softens the hair and skin. So again, looking at this cross section of skin, we have the epidermal layer, the dermal layer, and then the hypodermis or subcutaneous fat. And we'll see these sebaceous glands being right alongside the hair follicle. So this would be an individual hair follicle with a single body hair here. And then this would be a photomicrograph of a sectioned sebaceous gland. So again, that is going to be right adjacent to a hair follicle, meaning the secretion is basically going to be pushed up alongside this hair. Okay, let's talk a little bit about hair itself. The functions of hair are going to be to alert the body to the presence of parasites on the skin. Also, guarding the scalp against physical trauma, heat loss, and sunlight. Distribution of hair, it's the entire surface of the body except palms, soles, lips, nipples, and portions of the external genitalia. What is hair? So hair itself, basically very similar to the keratinized layer of our epidermis. It's actually going to be a different form of keratin, hard keratin, rather than the soft keratin that we find in the skin. But basically it is just a filament of dead keratinized cells. So it is going to be comprised of hard keratin. It is more durable than the soft keratin of the skin. And there are a number of hair pigments. Most of these are due to melanins, which produce colors that range from yellow all the way to black. And the reason why people get gray or white hair as they age, it's not because you have a different pigment showing through, it's because you have a decreased melanin production. So the normal production of the pigment melanin basically just decreases, and you also see increased air bubbles within the shaft of the hair. So looking at kind of a lateral view here, surface of the skin, hair follicle with the single hair here, and then this would be a photomicrograph showing the hair itself in the middle, and then basically this entire width here is the follicle wall. The hair follicle extends from the epidermal surface into the dermis. So epidermal surface, of course, is our most superficial layer of skin. Dermis is our middle layer. The follicle has a two-layered wall consisting of an outer connective tissue root sheath and an inner epithelial root sheath. So remember, think back to histology, epithelial versus connective tissues. And then the hair bulb is just the expanded deep end, which we've probably all seen this if we've accidentally pulled hair out of our own scalp. You'll see that expanded deep end of the hair that has been detached from the follicle. The hair follicle also has what's known as a hair follicle receptor or root hair plexus, which is sensory nerve endings around each hair bulb. This is going to be the cause of pain when we accidentally do pull a hair out, but it's also going to be stimulated by anytime a hair is bent. So this is going to be really important for sensing stimuli, sensing contact by, say, an insect or a potential parasite on our body surface. We also see erector pili muscles. These are smooth muscles that are attached to hair follicles. Remember that smooth muscle is something that is under involuntary control. So we do not have conscious control over our smooth muscle functionality like we do with our skeletal muscles, for example, and it's smooth because it is non-striated. So you don't see the patterning that we see in cardiac and skeletal muscle tissue that's due to that overlapping pattern of actin and myosin proteins. The erector pili muscles are ultimately what are responsible for goosebumps, This is when, of course, your hair stands on end, usually in a situation where you're cold and trying to thermoregulate, but sometimes if one becomes frightened or scared, you also get goosebumps as well. And this is basically a vestigial reflex. So, for example, mammals that have a thick hair coat, they will, in very cold weather, what happens is their hair will stand on end. So imagine that this is a layer of hair on a mammal, and this is the epidermal layer right here, and then deep to that is the dermis. So what hair really does is it acts as a really good insulator. So mammals, for example, will lose a lot of body heat to the environment, but by standing the hairs on end, what that does is it helps to trap the warm air that is trying to escape from the body. So air is a really good thermal insulator. You see this with mammals on cold days. You also see this with birds fluffing out their feathers. So it's the same basic response. And with humans, of course, we come from ancestors who had a much denser coat of body hair. And now it's kind of just a vestigial or primitive response that we don't really get a lot of benefit from. So this basically just shows a longitudinal view of the hair bulb within the follicle. So this would be that expanded bulb. And then here you see the erector pili muscle. Again, that's going to be smooth muscle. So when that contracts, that is going to cause this hair to become more rigid and stand on end. Okay, finishing up this lecture on the integumentary system, I'm going to talk a little bit about skin cancer and then also burns and injury that can occur to the skin. Most skin tumors are benign, meaning they do not metastasize. They do not spread. They don't interfere with normal body functioning. However, you do have some forms of skin cancer that are potentially even life-threatening. The good news about skin cancer is that oftentimes it is one of the more treatable forms of cancer. And it also kind of gets a lot of press in terms of increased awareness about the dangers of tanning beds, for example, and too much exposure to the sun. So the risk factors with skin cancer: overexposure to UV radiation and frequent irritation of the skin. There are actually some skin lotions that contain enzymes delivered in these little vesicles known as liposomes that can fix damaged DNA. And then I'll talk briefly about burns, and I will include a note of caution here. There are some images of burn patients, so actual photographs of various types of burns from 1st to 3rd degree burns in the next couple of slides. So burns can be due to heat, electricity, radiation, and certain chemicals. So you can have a chemical burn, you can have a sunburn due to too much solar radiation. You can have a burn caused by heat, for example, if you touch a hot stove. So what happens with burns, no matter what the ultimate cause is tissue damage. That causes proteins to denature. Proteins, of course, are really sensitive to changes in both temperature and pH. So if you have high heat exposure, you're going to end up denaturing proteins in your cells, and that will ultimately lead to cell death, because without these functional proteins, you can't carry out your normal metabolic functions. The immediate threat in terms of treatment is going to be dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Of course, our skin helps to keep water in. And if we compromise that integument, we can actually lose a lot of water. Also, electrolyte imbalance, and that can lead to renal shutdown and circulatory shock. Renal refers to kidneys. Okay, so partial thickness burns. There's two types of partial thickness burns. Partial thickness just refers to not penetrating all 3 layers of the integument. We have our 1st degree burns and our 2nd degree burns in this category. So with a 1st degree burn, this might be, for example, if you touch a hot surface that's not necessarily a very hot oven. So if you touch a burner that's still warm, for example, it's going to cause epidermal damage only. It's going to result in localized redness, edema, which is swelling, as well as pain. So you'll typically see redness that can persist for hours or a day or so or more. With a 2nd degree burn, you're going to have both epidermal and upper dermal damage, and a blister is actually going to appear. So this would be typical of, say, touching an oven rack accidentally. Maybe your oven mitt is damaged, or maybe you're just touching the surface that you just didn't realize was hot or accidental. The blisters are actually going to show separation between your epidermis and dermal layers. So what a blister is showing you is the outer layer of the blister is your epidermis. And then the layer below that is going to be your dermis. So you might have accumulation of fluid between these 2 layers of your integument. And this is something that can produce a little bit more long-term damage, maybe on the scale of a few days, for example. All right, so this is a photo showing a palm of a hand with both 1st and 2nd degree burns. So your 1st degree burns basically on the fingertips here, it's going to show that localized redness. There's going to be pain and some swelling as a result of that. The 2nd degree burns is where you actually see the blistering. So all of this would be 2nd degree burn. And then a 3rd degree burn, this happens when the entire thickness of the skin is damaged, all the way from the epidermis through the hypodermis. Coloration as a result of these burns can vary from gray-white to cherry red or even black. Now, the interesting thing about 3rd degree burns, you may have heard that 2nd degree burns are the most painful. And there's truth to that, because with a full thickness burn like this, you're actually not going to have initial swelling or pain because the nerve endings themselves have been destroyed. So the damage is more extensive, but you're not actually going to feel direct pain in those areas based on the destruction of those nerve endings that would allow you to sense that pain. With a 3rd degree burn, skin grafting is usually necessary. And this is an image showing a 3rd degree burn. In this case, you see kind of this cherry red appearance. So you can see that basically the full thickness of the skin has been affected by this 3rd degree burn. Okay, so that wraps up an introduction to the integumentary system. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for listening.